Welcome to Trust Us, Estate Planning Wisdom, the podcast where we unravel the complexities of estates and trusts to empower you with the knowledge needed for effective estate planning.
This podcast is hosted by seasoned estates and trust attorneys, Danielle Friedman, Herb Fineburg, and Charles Max McCauley.
This podcast is your guide to the intricate landscapes of estate planning, including wills, trusts, and probate.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope you find the discussion informative. But remember, when it comes to legal matters, always consult with a qualified attorney regarding your specific case. Hey, Herb.
Hey, how you doing, Danielle?
Good. So we're missing Max today, unfortunately, but we have a really interesting topic, which is something that's been in the cultural zeitgeist lately. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list for 22 weeks, and that is the book Strangers by Belle Burden. I read this a few weeks ago and found it really interesting because it touched on a lot of the topics that we discussed during our podcast, specifically commingling assets in a marriage and the use of trusts and how to protect inherited assets.
And also it talks a lot about prenuptial agreements.
Yeah.
Which is like, whoa, that's a real important thing. So Danielle, if you could tell me about Belle Burden, which is the wife, and the husband's name is in the book is James because they're hiding his identity.
Yeah.
Although other magazines have written about who these people really are. What's Belle's heritage?
Yeah, so Belle Burden is the author of this book, and she comes from very significant means. Her father is a descendant of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a railroad titan, and on her mother's side, someone was the founder of Standard Oil. Her grandmother was a famed New York socialite, Babe Paley, who was married at one point to, I think, a Rockefeller, and then also Bill Paley, who's the founder of the CBS network. And so Belle, over time, inherited a lot of money. Her father died relatively young. She is survived by a mother and a stepmother, but she has trusts and talks about them in connection with her marriage to her husband, who became independently wealthy as a lawyer and then a hedge fund manager.
So as I recall, I read the book too. It was an interesting read. As I recall, Belle was a lawyer as well, and quite a sophisticated lawyer, business lawyer, when she married her law firm colleague, who was her supervisor.
Yeah, these were not uneducated people, and they worked at a white shoe law firm in New York City in the 90s and eventually got married. And Belle did what a lot of women do, which is she quit her job and really became a full-time parent while her husband continued to climb the legal ladder and then the corporate ladder. And ultimately, they amassed a significant amount of wealth. But part of their deal when they entered into the marriage was that they were going to sign a prenuptial agreement, because that's what all of Belle's other family members had done. And the attorney who was Belle's attorney kind of gave her the standard family prenup. And her husband, who was an attorney and was also represented by counsel, had some changes to the prenup, which Belle was, a little resistant to, but ultimately succumbed to.
But Belle's attorney said he did not like the change that James wanted to the prenup.
Right. And ultimately, Belle signed it with the changes without notifying her family that she had signed the modified version, which goes to the point we talked about prenups before, where with an irrevocable trust, the beneficiaries can't change the terms of the irrevocable trust. It's kind of take it or leave it. But with a prenup, it's a contract between the couple getting married. And so even if Belle's family wanted her to sign an airtight prenup, the terms could be changed by her spouse, and Belle agreed to those modified terms and entered into a contract that had ultimately terms that were unfavorable to her. Because what happens in this book, and I don't think I'm spoiling it for anyone, is that we learn what happens to the assets in the marriage over the course of the marriage and their eventual divorce. And we learn that Belle did some things with her trust that we would strongly advise against, which we'll get into in a moment. But one of the things that the prenup said was that anything that you earn during the marriage is separate unless you specifically commingle it with as marital property. And so anything that her husband owned was that he kept in a separate account was his. Anything that she earned that was kept in a separate account was hers. And anything that they titled into joint names was joint for purposes of the marriage and importantly for purposes of a divorce. So if they were going to get divorced, anything would be split. If anything that was joint would be split 50-50.
So one of the big distinctions between a prenup and a trust is that, as you said, a prenup can be changed. And in fact, throughout the book, Belle is praying that James will not enforce the prenup because he doesn't have to. It's just a contract between a husband and a wife, which they can do anything they want. It's really covering the worst case scenario, while a trust cannot be changed. It's a trust that was, in this situation, set up by her great-grandfathers or great-grandparents. So these people were thoughtful. We said Belle got an inheritance, but her inheritance was a trust to protect her from this exact situation, her getting married and her then getting divorced. But what did Belle do wrong in handling these trusts? She's only the beneficiary, so she's really relying upon the trustees to do their duty.
Yeah, so you asked what Belle did wrong, and I think it's better framed as what did the trustees do wrong, even though this book is not about the trustees. But at one point, Belle goes into the details of how her and her husband acquired some very valuable real estate in Martha's Vineyard and also in Manhattan. And basically says that she went to the trustees, asked for money from her trust, which nearly depleted her trust, as she describes
One of her trusts.
It nearly depleted that trust. And she went, she took the money and purchased both of these pieces of real estate in joint names, which, as we know, under the prenup, if Belle and her husband get divorced, anything joint goes 50-50. So the trust is not getting anything back. Belle is losing out on 50% of the asset that came out of this trust. And Belle, being a woman in love at the time, thought she was doing the right thing. But her trustees, on the other hand, we don't know who they are, if it was a corporate trustee, if it was individuals, really should have said, Belle, no, we can lend you the money to buy these homes. The trust can buy the real estate, but taking the money out of the trust to buy the real estate and put it in joint names, not even just keep it in Belle's individual name, which under the terms of the prenup would have been okay, is a really bad idea. And it seems like Belle either didn't seek advice or got bad advice. But that really, as a trust and estates attorney, when I read that, that really got me worked up more so than the surprise we're getting divorced after 20 years of marriage.
One of the things I learned from reading the book is the natural things that happen when you get married.
So at one point, she says in the book, I agreed to change the prenup, dismissing legal advice. I put both our names on the deeds. I chose not to be involved in our financial life. I failed to make sure our prenup was extinguished. I failed to think about what would happen if our marriage ended. I did it for love. There's nothing shameful about that.
Very interesting. Again, she's not talking about money that she earned during her life. She's not talking about money that James earned during her life. She's talking about what her great-grandparents left her. And they're the ones who are deciding what is to be done with this property. She thinks that the inheritance through this trust is what she should just do what she wants. And she does what she wants, which is like many married couples do. They're in love. They don't think that anything is going to end. But obviously, one of the reasons that we have trust is many situations can arise that are unexpected. This was one of them.
Yeah, and I think that beneficiaries of trusts really wear two hats. One is that they are, of course, beneficiaries. The trust is there to support them as they need, but they also need to consider that they're stewards of the money for the next generation and generations beyond. In this case, as there were millions and millions of dollars in these various trusts. So I think that it was short-sighted to take money out, buy valuable real estate, put it into joint names, and then hope and pray that your husband doesn't enforce the prenup when you ultimately get divorced, because the structure was there to protect you all along.
James and Belle had a meeting with their lawyer, their estate planning lawyer, their joint estate planning lawyer. And the joint estate planning lawyer had on the agenda terminating the prenuptial agreement. And she writes about the meeting with the lawyer. And when it got to the end of the meeting, James said he had to leave. And he said he wanted to put that off for another meeting. So this whole concept of terminating the prenup was not something that had to come up when they got divorced. She had it brought to her attention well ahead of time.
Yes. And James, I think, was very shrewd because he knew what the prenup said. He knew how the real estate was titled, and it was not in his best interest necessarily to terminate that prenup. And I don't know how long he had been planning to leave Belle, but this was something that clearly gave him power and put leverage in his corner by having the prenup in place during the divorce. And ultimately, she was at his whim when to decide what to do with the real estate, because the way she described it in the book is that this was her home where her children grew up. She still had teenagers at home, and she thought it would be unimaginable to not keep these properties and raise the kids in the home. And she really didn't want James to take half, which would have meant having to sell the properties.
Right. So one of the lessons learned is she takes the money out of the trust, and let's say the real estate's worth, $15 million in Tribeca and Martha's Vineyard total. To keep the houses, she'd have to raise $7.5 million somewhere else. So she's not only taking the money out of the trust, but she has to find $7.5 million somewhere else to pay James off to get divorced from him.
Right.
It was also interesting to find out what James did with the money that he earned each year, which was at one point millions of dollars a year, working for, I believe, I might have it wrong, working for a hedge fund that her uncle ran. He knew how to take advantage of the situation and get a great job through her uncle. What did he do with all his money?
He squirreled it away, and it seems like James really studied the prenup because he kept everything in a separate account, didn't commingle it with any of the marital assets. And when they got divorced, he didn't have to give up any of the millions and millions of dollars that he had accumulated during the course of the marriage. Meanwhile, Belle, despite having support through a number of different trusts, had stopped working, was doing some charitable work on the side, but her primary responsibility was really raising the children, and she was not an earner in the family. And then to find that he was not sharing those assets with her at all, except probably covering some mutual expenses during the marriage. But I think it also was an important lesson to all people in marriages to make sure you understand the finances and understand where money is going after it's earned, and not to be asleep at the wheel when it comes to financial literacy.
So in the beginning, you mentioned that this isn't really that much about Belle falling asleep at the wheel because she's in love. Who's not in love here?
The trustees. What would you have done if you were Belle's trustee? How would you have handled it differently?
I would have done just as you said at the beginning, which is tell her the money has to stay in the trust and we can have the trust buy the house. That way, it's always a house available to Belle. It's always a house available to Belle's kids, who are going to ultimately become the beneficiaries of the trust. And when the property gets sold, the kids will enjoy it. The grandkids will enjoy it. It will stay in the family. That's number one. Number two, if you don't want to buy the house in the trust, because not all trusts have millions and millions of dollars to buy $15 million of personal residences, you can lend the money to her. But at the very least, the worst case scenario is they give Belle the money and they counsel her on how to title the real estate. It just takes a little bit. Why is that beneficial? Because separately owned property, especially inheritances, are protected by state laws everywhere. They don't become marital assets. So we have in state statutes almost a sort of protection you might find in a prenuptial agreement. So it's really just waiting for the child to just blow it and commingle it and title it jointly. Even state statutes don't protect it on every situation. It protects it in the event of divorce, but it doesn't protect it necessarily in the event the spouse dies owning the assets, even if a spouse is in the individual name. And I think that's because what they call spousal election against the estate of a deceased spouse.
Yeah, and we didn't have to deal with that issue in the book, but had Belle had the asset in her individual name and had died owning it, assuming the prenup didn't waive the elective share, then James would have been entitled to roughly a third of the real estate. So keeping it in the trust is still always the most protective approach. I agree with you. I think, spoiler alert, in the end, Belle ends up with the properties. James relents and agrees to waive the terms of the prenup when it comes to the real estate. But had things not ended in her favor, I can only imagine that the next phone call would have been to a fiduciary litigator to sue her trustees as to why they allowed her to withdraw the money and put it into joint names, and why didn't they counsel her, and why didn't they protect the funds. And I mean, even the remainder beneficiaries of this trust, who presumably are Belle's children, could have sued the trustees and said, you should have never distributed the property outright to our mother. You should have kept it in the trust.
So 2 points. The first point you made was very good, which is that the prenuptial agreement can waive the elected share that's provided in the statute. That wasn't discussed in the book. But it's interesting. Her kids are not current beneficiaries, but contingent beneficiaries. Do they have standing to object to anything?
They do. They do. They are the ultimate beneficiaries of the trust. I'm making a lot of assumptions here, but we don't go into the terms of the trust in the book, but presumably it's for the benefit of Belle and then her descendants, because that's how most trusts are. So they would, as beneficiaries, have standing to bring a claim against the trustee.
So another lesson learned is you need to think about who you want to have as trustee. That the trustee needs to be somebody who is thoughtful and not there as a token individual.
You don't want a yes man as a trustee.
And maybe the trustee needs to get his own counsel or her own counsel and say, what do you recommend that we do? Because not necessarily all trustees are lawyers or in a corporate fiduciary department or something of that sort.
Absolutely. I think all trustees should have independent counsel advising them as to what to do when beneficiaries approach them with a distribution request for their own protection, because being a trustee is nearly all risk, frankly. Definitely get counsel if you're ever asked to serve in a fiduciary capacity. Herb, I hope everyone goes and reads this book. I think it's an easy, quick read. It's about 200 some pages, and I don't think we spoiled it too bad. It's kind of a juicy story about how this marriage unravels. But maybe when you read what Herb and I read, you'll have the same type of gut reaction and that, oh, she shouldn't have done that. Oh, no.
Queasy feeling.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Danielle. That was very entertaining.